what I call maybe the non-financial benefits of farmland. So you can hunt it, you can hike on it, you can fish on it, you can grow food on it. And I think all of a sudden people really got connected with land in a way that was beyond just the investment characteristics. Now it was like a lifestyle characteristic. You just got all of those factors coming together. And being a farm kid, I've always known farmland's the greatest asset on earth, but I think the rest of the world has started to discover that.
Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, a show about human environments and how they can be used as a force for good. Conversations that educate and inspire people looking for a different way to do real estate. I'm Neal Collins, and on this episode, I talk with Steve Bruere, the president of the agricultural brokerage People's Company, about the state of regeneration within the ag industry and the mixed-use agrihood Middlebrook that he's developing in Iowa. So over the past 5 years at Latitude, we've gotten hundreds of emails, not just from people looking for a house, but for people searching for something deeper. They want community. They want connection. They want to live somewhere where food and farming are woven into everyday life, where shared values of health, stewardship, and well-being are the norm. And I'll be honest, that's like a moth to a flame for me. Because while the demand is clearly there, the supply, not so much. There was this report published by the Urban Land Institute back in 2018. It said there were around 200 agrihoods in the US. And sure, that number was projected to grow. But in reality, if those communities do exist, they're either way under the radar or they don't quite live up to the vision. Some look more like intentional communities. Others, you could maybe call them agrihoods if you squint. And a lot, they're still on the drawing board or stuck in development limbo. What I've been searching for, what so many people seem to be craving, are communities where the farm is truly the heartbeat, where regenerative agriculture is the foundation, where the layout is walkable, the spaces are mixed use, and the culture is inclusive for all ages, incomes, and backgrounds. And while there aren't many of these places yet, I don't think it's going to stay that way. I believe that we're entering into a kind of a renaissance in community development, one that values farmland and nature not as afterthoughts, but as essential infrastructure, as the starting point. Which brings me to today's guest, Steve Bruere. Steve is the president of People's Company, one of the leading ag-focused brokerages in the country, with offices in 35 states. So if there's anyone with a pulse on what's happening with farmland in America, it's Steve. But here's the thing. He's not just brokering deals, he's also building something. It's called Middlebrook, a 540-acre, 1,500-home community in Cumming, Iowa. At the heart of it, a 20-acre organic farm. Add to that a variety of housing types, a commercial center, and a whole lot of community spirit, and you've got a compelling example of what an agrihood can be. In this episode, Steve shares how it came together, the lessons, the challenges, and what it's taken to build a real place, not just a concept. We'll start with the state of regenerative agriculture, and then we'll get into the real stuff. This is the story of Middlebrook. Let's get into it. But why don't we start at the beginning here, Steve? Like, what really set the trajectory for you to get into farmland real estate?
Yeah, I grew up on a farm just south of Des Moines in central Iowa. My brother farms with my dad, and my brother's 4 years older than me, so he was always kind of the one destined to take over the family farm. And my grandpa ran the Ford New Holland farm equipment dealership in the county seat where I grew up, and my folks were also Pioneer seed corn dealers and whatnot. So grew up really in the middle of agriculture, and I always had a passion for farmland and real estate growing up. And I remember the sale bills would show up for a farm that was going to come up for sale, and I was always urging my folks to go buy more farm ground. And of course, like any farmer, they may be like buying farm machinery as well. And so there's always that conflict between expanding the farming operation and buying farmland. And so when I was in college, bought my first farm on an installment contract from a neighbor, and I had an opportunity to come work for People's Company right out of college back in 2003, and that's kind of how I got into the business.
What did that look like with the decision between joining People's Company and becoming a farmer? Was there much thought into that?
One, my brother just kind of he was out planting corn in high school and running the combine and whatnot, and it was clear he was going to take over the farming operation. So then there was like, all right, what am I going to do? And I'm sure there could have been room for both of us, but frankly, I wasn't real mechanically inclined, and I was maybe a little more entrepreneurial than just running the farm equipment and whatnot. So it was pretty natural for me. And the way it kind of sorted out growing up with the seed corn business, I was out helping farmers load their trucks with seed, and my grandpa was an entrepreneur, and so I always had a little bit more of that kind of entrepreneurial itch, to get out and see the world and do things and whatnot. My family farm is still very much a part of what I do, and it's fun to watch my brother grow that and go down there and help out once in a while. And if something breaks, I get to leave and not have to deal with the problems. So
Stephen, in 2003, you joined People's Company. It's my understanding that you've overseen a lot of changes at the company, but at that time, what did it look like whenever you're joining?
yeah, we started out back in the 1960s. It was a farm management department for a bank. We were spun out of the bank during a bank merger in the 70s, and if you follow that original People's Bank charter through, we'd be part of Regions Bank today. It was ran as a small mom pop real estate and farm management business from 72 to 2002. And ironically, my parents farmed some farms that People's Company managed growing up. And so when I was graduating from college in 2003, the company went through another ownership transition. And the group that bought it hired me right out of college. And about a year in, they turned the keys over to me. It was pretty clear that it was more of a passive thing for them, and I was going to be more of a career for me. And so I had an opportunity to step into a really unique situation and really start growing the business. And so for the last, 22, 23 years now, have really expanded it outside of Iowa and built a national footprint for People's Company.
So a year in, they hand over the keys to you. What was that like? I mean, did you have visions for the future that really captivated the leadership at the time, or what's been the process of development of the company?
It was interesting. Like, if you look at commercial real estate and residential real estate, there's some really established global brands, national brands. So in commercial, you've got, CB Richard Ellis and Jones Lang LaSalle and Cushman Wakefield and a lot of great firms. On the residential side, you had the Remaxes and the Century 21s and the Caldwell Bankers and whatnot. And when you looked at farmland, there really wasn't anybody that was really operating nationally, let alone globally. There's a lot of great county seat firms like what People's Company was. There's some nice regional firms, some nice statewide firms, but really nobody doing it at a national scale. And so had some pretty ambitious ideas on what that could look like. And the beauty of youth is sometimes you're too young and dumb to know better. And so I was ambitious enough at the time to really try to create this national brand. And here we are, 20 some years later, still beating our heads against the wall trying to do it.
What are some of those catalytic moves that you're most proud of? I mean, you've got a really impressive resume, and anybody that wants to learn more about what your background is, I mean, it's a lot of things of achievements. But what are some that really stick out to you that have been catalytic for that growth?
There was one transaction in particular I got involved in. I think it was in 2016. It was a 6,000 acre sale in Walla Walla, Washington. The family had asked us if we would help market this asset. And it was a dryland wheat farm that had a water right that they thought should be developed into wine grapes and apples. And so here I am out in Washington trying to figure this asset out from Iowa, being a corn and soybean guy, and really had to understand not necessarily what its current use was, but what its highest and best use could be and what you could do with it in the future. And had to really understand the wine industry to get our hands around that and learn far more than I ever thought I would about, growing degree units, slope and aspect and range and elevation and soil characteristics and all the things that go into making a great wine. And so that sale ended up being successful and really put us on the map nationally. for running a big sales process and successfully completing it. And that just led to more and more deals. And we opened an office in Walla Walla a couple years later, and now I've gotten really active in that region, and that's been kind of, you know, I could just go to transaction after transaction where we got involved in a certain area, and then that's led to future growth of what we're doing as we, approach things maybe a little more unconventionally.
How do you open up new markets like that? I mean, if you're a firm out of Iowa, but to get called into the Pacific Northwest, I mean, is there a protocol for that? How do you get your name out there?
We host an event in Iowa every year. We started hosting it in 2009 called the Land Investment Expo, and we bring in about 1,400 people to that event annually. And then we'll have another five or 600 online. And so this has became one of the events that if you're in farmland and agriculture, you want to be at. And so that's opened up a lot of doors. National media comes, a lot of the major asset managers in the farmland space attend, big trust departments, banks, institutional investors. That's created a network that, frankly, had we not started hosting that event, we wouldn't have a lot of those deep connections and whatnot. But then outside of that, we've been able to, acquire some firms. Last year was a pretty aggressive year. We bought a few firms in Illinois and a few in Nebraska that were farm management businesses. When you do that, you end up with farms in different states that you're managing and different relationships, and it just kind of feeds on itself a little bit.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. What I think over that time period, and maybe this is just me and the algorithms that show up for me, but it seems like farmland investing has become much more in vogue, or at least more talked about outside of just that core industry. I think it's now an asset class that a lot of investors are talking about. And I'm curious why you think that is. Maybe you can either validate or steer me down a different path.
That's a deep one, but I think there's a lot of factors. If you go back, and I actually go back to like the '08 financial crisis when the world came to an end and, stock market was collapsing and commercial and residential real estate markets were collapsing. You actually saw a lot of people that were looking for alternative assets to invest in, that had different stability. And when you look at farmland, and this is getting a little geeky, but farmland is positively correlated with inflation and it's negatively correlated with public equities, meaning more inflation you have, the better farmland's going to do. And if the stock market's crashing, then the farmland markets probably aren't crashing at the same time, right? And so there was a big investor appetite that came out of that '08 financial crisis looking for alternative places to put their money. And then you had this really cheap money experiment with the monetary policy in the United States where capital became, virtually free for a while. And returns on farmland are low historically relative to other returns when you just look at like the cash yield. And so when you get free money, all of a sudden farmland became an attractive asset class for people to say, hey, I get that non-correlation with public equities. I get positively correlated with inflation. The returns are nominal, but the appreciation rates in farmland are pretty exceptional. And so you had a lot of people fall in love with the asset class. And that happened, as people starting to get more focused on their diets and food and whatnot. So I think you had kind of the financial side of it, but then you had the next generation coming in saying, "Hey, I care about where my food's grown and who the farmer is and what I'm putting into my body." And so you had that movement happening, and then you throw COVID in there, and people are locked in their homes. And if you look at what land values did during COVID, people appreciated getting outdoors. What I call maybe the non-financial benefits of farmland. So you can hunt it, you can hike on it, you can fish on it, you can grow food on it. And I think all of a sudden people really got connected with land in a way that was beyond just the investment characteristics. Now it was like a lifestyle characteristic. You just got all of those factors coming together. And being a farm kid, I've always known farmland's the greatest asset on earth, but I think the rest of the world has started to discover that.
That's interesting. And it makes me think about the conversation or maybe the conventional wisdom that people have been saying, like the average age of farmers is getting older and older. We're expecting this like large glut of land to hit the market and transition. What's your perspective on that? I would imagine there's got to be some nuance in there that I'm really curious to learn about.
I'm not going to have these stats exactly right, but the Iowa legislature requires Iowa State University to do a land tenure study every 5 years where they go in and study the age of landowners. And so Iowa's got some of the best landowner data, and farmers are getting older every year. Landowners are getting older every year. And a lot of people have been predicting that there'd be this massive amount of land hit the market ever since 20 years I've been in the real estate business. And it really hasn't happened. About 1 to 2% of all the farmland in the U.S. hits the public market on an annual basis. Yeah, landowners are getting older, but they're living longer. And of course, at some point, that will come to an end inevitably. But a lot of land gets passed on to their kids and their kids' kids and sold to the farmer who's been farming it, whatnot. And I really don't see this massive glut of land coming on the market like a lot of people predict. And then, yeah, farmers are aging as well. But if we put a farm like that we're managing up for rent here in Iowa, we'll have 20 people knocking at the door begging to rent it. There's no shortage of farmers. So there's definitely some sensationalizing of farmers getting older and we're going to run out of farmers. I don't see that happening, I guess.
What's the conversation around access for maybe the next generation of farmers? Is that a pretty hot topic around being able to afford the price of land or find available spaces for lease?
Yeah, that's a bigger issue. You've got this asset class where farmland prices have inflated to a point where it's really tough for anybody to buy their first piece of land, and it's so competitive for young farmers to get access to land to farm. I think what you're starting to see is a little bit of bifurcation of the land and the farming operation, where you're seeing more investors that own the land and more farmers that are renting the land versus owned and operated. And to have the capital as a young farmer to come in and put the capital into the equipment and into the land, that'd be pretty tough to do from scratch. Like, unless you grew up on a farm or inherited a farm or had some alternative source of income to pay for it, it'd be really tough to get into farming today. Now, of course, that's the conventional large farming that I'm used to, where you've got large machinery and large operations. But from an entrepreneurial young farmer, growing sweet corn, growing pumpkins, that sort of thing, I don't think that's necessarily as hard to get into. That's not necessarily the type of farming a lot of people are going to build a career and you know do that hard work, frankly.
Yeah. If land is seen as this appreciating asset that's quite stable, what is going on for the farming side of the equation? I mean, if they're having to go out and lease land, are they able to get the same kind of price yields year over year with that increase that's probably coming from the cost of the lease?
Yeah, so I think if you're just and playing with spreadsheets gets a little, you can manipulate them and make them tell you what you want them to say sometimes. But if you just had like a certain amount of equity as a farmer, and you're like, I can put my equity into land, or I can put my equity into expanding my operation, you know, if the commodity price environment's right, you can spread your machinery cost over more acres and rent more acres. Then the return on adding additional leased acres can be, pretty attractive and likely more attractive than the cap rate you would get on the farm itself. So, but that stuff cycles, and sometimes you have really strong commodity price environments, and sometimes you have really weak commodity price environments, and farmland becomes a little bit of a forced savings account in some ways. Like, you're paying down the debt every year and you're getting a little appreciation. And, all of a sudden, 5 or 10 years in, you've created some really nice equity. Whereas if you're expanding your farming operation all the time, you just need more capital to continue to expand the operation. So both ways you can make money. I mean, you can make money farming and you can make money being a farmland investor.
Hmm. So I would be remiss if we were just to go talk about commodity farming right now because of the nature of the podcast. And you had hinted at this before, really around the consciousness of people of what is going in their bodies and the food that they're eating. Certainly mainstream media has picked up on the declining health of our topsoil. Where is this conversation that you see, especially coming out of Iowa, with a move towards regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, we see it all because we manage farms in 25 states, and so anything from rice and cotton in the Delta to corn and soybeans in the Midwest, wine grapes in the PNW to almonds in California, and so get exposed to a lot of different farming practices and approaches. And, you hear it all, you see it all. We have clients that read an article and come in and I want to do this on my farm and whatnot. One of the observations I've had on like some of our organic farming operations is that, people have taken that USDA organic seal and said, okay, that means that this is a more sustainable food. That's a more healthy food than conventional food would be. I look at some of our organic operations where we have more tillage, more fossil fuels because you're running the tractor, more erosion, less grown per acre than the conventional. If you look at the carbon footprint of organic versus conventional, that will tell you a completely different story than if your belief is the food's healthier and whatnot. And so, as we've lived through several experiments, I would say on farms that we're involved in, I've really become a big believer in cover crops. And I remember on a farm I own personally, that I rent to my dad and brother. I remember I flew on cover crops one summer into the standing crop of, I believe it was soybeans. And so dad shows up to harvest the soybeans, and I forgot to tell him that there's going to be cover crops. And there's this green, lawn underneath the soybeans growing. Actually, it was corn. Excuse me, it was corn. He's harvesting corn, and there's this rye growing in the corn. And he called me and he's like, "Hey, what'd you do here? Are you expecting me to pay for this?" And at the time, he hadn't been exposed to the cover crops, and so we actually, within our farm management business, have this LIDAR topo program where we can look at soil erosion based on different farming practices. And so this particular farm was 160 acres, and I ran the soil loss calculator. And when I got done with the calculations, I realized I was losing about 47 dump trucks of soil annually from erosion on that farm. Just conventional farming practices, nothing irresponsible, just farming it the way everybody farms. And we ran the simulation if we added cover crops to it, and it went down to like 7 dump trucks of soil. Somebody made a comment to me, well, hey, you can't price that topsoil loss. Like once it's gone forever. And I'm like, well, you can import more topsoil and you can add more nutrients to that topsoil. And so you can calculate what a dump truck of soil cost. And it just dawned on me, like people need to change how they think about cover crops because at the time they were trying to think about who should pay for it, the landowner or the farmer. Will my yields go up? Will I make more money? And I was looking at it more from this is my asset. Once that topsoil's gone, if I have to replace that topsoil, then I'm going to have to spend money to replace it in the future. And when you start to think about that, I think a lot of people think farmers, it's their job with a 1 year lease to protect the asset. And I realized that it's my job as the landowner to protect the asset and not, my dad and brother who are just trying to make money on a 1 year lease, trying to grow crops on that farm. I really got kind of sucked into the whole idea of cover crops and farming responsibly and some of these regenerative practices over and above organic. And I really feel like the consumer was more interested in how their food was grown and who grew it and that it was done responsibly and less worried about organic in and of itself. So we started to think about, how can you farm regeneratively and cover crops, obviously, and no-till, and some of those things are a big part of that.
Interesting. And have you seen more people in the land management side really looking for you guys for rotational grazing and more polycultural growing, or is this still, people are waiting to see where this all goes?
Yeah, I mean, livestock's a huge part of regenerative. So we've got a couple organic assets in Oregon where we've got the rotational grazing. In Iowa, there's 27 million crop acres, right? There's not enough cattle to go around to put cattle on every acre. So there is a little bit of like practical, like how do you actually do some of this stuff at scale? And you get into, I call it kind of wicked problems. Like, do we want to feed the world or do we want to, everybody farm regeneratively and, eat organically and that sort of thing? They're competing interest in those thoughts. So it's like, I'm all for organic, I'm all for regenerative, but I'm also, all for feeding the world too. And so you have some competing interests there from time to time. And there's just the realities that we're not going to have cattle on every acre of farm ground in the country. Who's going to eat all the cattle, right? Like, what are you going to do with this stuff? So sometimes I think people's thinking that, only goes part way. And when you're pragmatic and think about the realities of how some of this stuff works, it's not necessarily practical to farm everything regeneratively.
This episode is brought to you by Hamlet Capital, an exciting new endeavor I founded to invest in the future of thriving communities. If you're developing an agrihood or conservation community, you know how complex these projects can be. From land acquisition and master planning to entitlements and securing investment capital, there's a fine line between a stalled out vision and a thriving built reality. That's where Hamlet Capital comes in. We provide development, advisory, and investment solutions that align financial returns with environmental and social impact, helping bring projects to life in a way that's both financially viable and deeply impactful. So if you're working on a project and need guidance or capital, or if you're looking to invest at the intersection between real estate and regenerative agriculture, reach out and let's build something lasting together. Visit us at hamlet.capital. Steve, there's a quote that I had picked up that I believe you had said, where it goes, "The benefits of sustainable and regenerative agriculture are clear over the medium to long term. What's missing is a way to create immediate new incentives for sustainable management." And I also think that you've got a background within carbon credits. And that's a question that I get lobbed all the time around carbon credits. And I'm not exactly sure how to answer it. So I'd love to get your insights on really what those incentives are. And is that something that comes in the form of a carbon credit?
Yeah, the carbon thing is interesting because to get a carbon credit, you have to have additionality, right, and permanence. And so when you think about how you get a carbon credit, we get, and this has died off a little bit the last couple of years, but I would say 5 years ago, you get a postcard every day on every farm you manage with somebody who has a carbon credit program, right? And everybody was really trying to figure out carbon credits. And you get these offers, $20 an acre, $30 an acre, like to enroll in these carbon credit programs. And we participated in a lot of pilots. But what nobody really figured out was that additionality and permanence thing. So you can go put cover crops on a farm and go no-till that farm. And if that was the first time that it had been no-tilled and the first time it had cover crops on it, now you've got additionality. You've put that carbon through the cover crop into the soil. But the minute that you come in and hit that with a disc or a plow, then you've lost the permanence of it. It's gone. And so how do you monetize that carbon credit, right? There's just a real practical, like how are these programs going to work? And the regulatory environment and the registry systems aren't in place to really do that at scale. We know plenty of people who will take money to practice no-till and put cover crops on. But I again, I don't think people have thought through the whole, like, how is this going to work long term? And there's plenty of checks getting written for this stuff. But the minute that you turn that ground over with a plow or a disc, it's gone. The carbon's, gone. So I think there's still a lot to be figured out there long term that hasn't been figured out yet.
That's really interesting. Do you think that pertains also? I've seen like biodiversity credits and just really thinking into like how do you provide incentives for these farmers? Do you see any others besides carbon that hold promise?
Yeah, there's these natural asset companies, like that's all the rage now. And I think aggregating programs and layering of programs, that's when you can start to have a meaningful structure, perhaps, where you can combine all these natural capital benefits into a larger pool and make them more valuable. And I think we're just starting to scratch the surface on what that could look like. But one thing you just said, a lot of people focus on incentivizing the farmer. And I want to go back to my example of the landowner. So in Iowa, 60% of the farmland's rented, meaning that it's not owner operated. And most land has a 1 year lease on it. Again, you just got to be like pragmatic and think about it. So the farmer's sole objective is not to make your asset worth more. It's not to make it more sustainable. Like their objective is, I'm renting this year and I want to make a profit farming the ground. And if you own an apartment building or a commercial building, your subway tenant isn't worried about how to make the building more valuable in the future or more sustainable. They're just trying to make sandwiches, right? And somehow, some way in agriculture, we've decided that the landowner shouldn't participate in these sustainability practices, and that's the farmer's problem. The farmer should be doing it. And I've just always struggled with like how we've all arrived at that conclusion. And I really think like the landowner needs to take a vested interest in protecting their asset, just like you would in commercial real estate and residential real estate.
That's interesting, especially if you've got the platform to run land management services for farmers. Do you get any pushback for that, or are your clients pretty receptive to really ponying up for appreciating the land over time like that?
100% perceptive. Like once you explain it to people, just almost like you maybe just had a little bit of a light bulb moment. Like, yeah, that actually makes sense. Again, I don't get why that hasn't been second nature to people, but it hasn't. So, like Iowa, if you look at historical farmland returns in Iowa, your cap rate right now, your cash yield, you buy a farm for 10,000 an acre, you rent it for $250, $250 or a 2.5% return, right? Well, your 20-year appreciation rate in Iowa is just shy of 8%. So now you've got 8 plus 2.5, 10.5% total return. So when you think about like if you were going to hire me to manage your farm and the greater return components, appreciation versus cash yield, would you want to hire me to maximize that cash yield that really competes against the farmer's profitability, or do you want to hire me to create maximum appreciation for the farm? And it's pretty clear you want to create maximum appreciation. That's the greater return. That's the sustainability. That's the natural resource function at work. It seems so obvious to me, but a lot of people miss that. Like I'll have people tell us, we don't need to hire you to manage our farm. We're already getting a great cash rent. It's like, well, that's one tiny part. That's like, 25% of the total return. The rest of the return is going to come from appreciation. So you really want to focus on how do you create superior appreciation for the asset. And that's where the sustainability practices really come into play.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's always like, what's the different ways in which people can be influenced? I think Hollywood and mainstream media has been really effective at telling this qualitative narrative of like it's our health and our soil but on the other side of that, it's how do you change people's minds? It's also the financial benefits of it. Of look, these two can go hand in hand, which is really wild.
It is. I've always said there's not enough good people that are going to pay for sustainability practices out of the goodness of their heart to fix any of the environmental problems in the world. So if you're going to solve sustainability challenges on farmland, you've got to find a way to make it like there's an economic benefit to it, because you can't create scale without an economic benefit. There's just not enough people that are going to do it for the charity of it. We've got a mapping platform, so we document all the yields on all the farms that we manage, and then we produce these profitability maps. And so you can look at every farm and say, okay, what percentage of the farm's not profitable, right? What we found when we first started doing this is about 10 to 15% of all the farms we manage, there's acres that were not being farmed profitably year after year after year. If you put your farmer hat on, you're like, all right, I'm going to throw more genetics. I'm going to throw more, whatever at those acres. I'm going to try to make them profitable versus like really trying to solve like, why aren't they profitable? Can they be profitable? And so we really think about like, how do we maximize the financial performance of the farm from a total return point of view, not just like, how do I grow more per acre on the farm? And what we found is where you have profitability issues on the farm, that's also where you have environmental issues. Those acres where you're ineffective at taking your inputs and turning those into a profitable commodity, that's also probably where you have erosion and, nitrate issues and fertility issues and whatnot. And so if you can really think about the two together, how do I make money? Then you can start to think about how can I do that sustainably and whatnot. And they don't necessarily have to be competing interests.
That is fascinating. One of the things that I was really interested to have you on is to talk more about Middlebrook Farm. This is an agrihood. I believe it's on 540 acres, but I love the branding that you guys have put out. It looks like a really cool place, and it's just picking up steam. Why don't you tell me more about that development?
Yeah, so we got involved in land development coming out of the '08 financial crisis. There was a lot of developers that were losing land to banks that were distressed and whatnot, and farmland values in Iowa were going up, and development values were going down. And I don't always advertise that, right? Like, being a farm kid and being in agriculture, developers have a little bit of a, reputation with folks and sometimes not, what farmers want to talk about. So, but anyhow, we started developing little land around central Iowa. And this was at the same time People's Company was starting to take off. And I started hearing about this Agrihood movement that was happening around the country. And there's some really well known Agrihoods, Serenbe, that Steve Nygren developed in Georgia, and Agritopia in Gilbert, Arizona. And so when I was traveling, I'd pop in and see some of these communities and wanted to potentially do something in Iowa. And so there's this little town called Cumming, Iowa. It's in Warren County where I grew up. I drive through Cumming from where I live to come to my office every day, and just had one of those epiphanies one day, like, this is where, somebody should put this Agrihood concept in Iowa. So we started acquiring a few parcels and started working with a land planning firm to develop this concept for what an Agrihood could look like. And that would have been probably 5 or 6 years ago. We started the wheels in motion for what's now Middlebrook. And it's been a real fun thing for me because it's kind of that intersection of land development, home building, and farming, and my hometown and whatnot. And so it's take a lot of pride in putting it together.
Yeah, what's that process look like? I mean, do you find that the municipality or the people of the town have been receptive and have embraced the development since the beginning?
Yeah, that's a long conversation. So this little town of Cumming, they were building 1 to 2 homes a year. The community was kind of pivoting towards large rural estate lots, like 5 acre type lots. And it was sandwiched between two other growing communities, Norwalk, where I live, and then West Des Moines, which would be one of the fastest growing communities in Iowa. And so there's about 500 homes being built in the two communities surrounding this charming, cute town. And, we started thinking about this concept of the neighborhood, which actually, when you hear that, you think large lots, chickens running around and whatnot. And as I was touring these projects, what I saw was actually the opposite. It was like more density, but more common area green space and tiny homes and unique architecture and street trees and community engagement and whatnot. So when we originally started down the journey with the city, the journey is probably the right way to say it. I mean, one, I was from Warren County. I was a farm kid, and they knew that they were going to have development pressure, and somebody was going to develop there, and they did a great job really protecting that identity of the community for a long time. And so I can't tell you that everybody's high fiving about what we're doing out there, because I'm sure there's people that aren't. If the community was going to get developed, I think the Agrihood theme was really unique and really thoughtful. And we have a great relationship with the mayor, a great relationship with the city council, great relationship with the city manager, P&Z. It's a very, very collaborative relationship at this point, but it took a long time to get to that point. There was definitely some skepticism initially about what we were doing and how it was going to work out and how committed we were, and that sort of thing. But now that we've, really moved everything forward that we conceptually laid out 5 years ago, we've developed a lot of trust with the community now.
That's really interesting. Was there a process to that? I mean, how do you go about figuring out all these elements from the farm to the housing to the commercial elements, and then translate that to outreach with the public?
Yeah, I keep saying journey, but we started with this master plan. So we hired a firm out of Aspen called Design Workshop that developed like this conceptual master plan of like what the community could look like. And there was meeting after meeting after meeting, and I'd toured projects around the country, and like took the elements that I liked of all of them and kind of brought together our own kind of version of what we saw when we toured these other communities. We had to get utilities in place. We had to get our annexation into the city in place. We had to get our zoning and PUD in place. And so you got all these conceptual visions you're working on. And then, of course, you've got the financial side of that. Like, the one thing about the Agrihood concept is it attracts a bunch of dreamers, right? Because, like, people are just like in love with the idea of being connected with food and agriculture and the community. And, all these ideas come out and people lose track of what we talked about earlier on the farming side, that if you're going to do anything, you got to make money, right? Otherwise, it's just like dreaming. So like you constantly are like battling, like, oh, that would be really cool if we could do this. And then you're putting on, you're like, all right, but if we're going to do this, we've got to do it profitably. Otherwise, it's not going to be a sustainable community, right? So we spent a lot of time making sure that we were hitting price points and we were doing it in a way that could be scalable and make a little money along the way.
So what is the business model there? Are you the master developer and you're selling lots, sell lots to builders? Are you building? Do you hold commercial? What does it look like under the hood?
Yeah, so it's in total now it's a little over 800 acres in size, and everything's been annexed into the city of Cumming. We've got all the utilities in place and the zoning in place now. We've got a PUD that designates which areas are going to be an ag and which areas are going to be commercial and residential and parks and green space. And so all of that vision now has kind of been firmed up with the city. We've probably built 60 or 70 homes since we've started, and we hired a town architect who reviews all the architectural plans. The streets have street trees. The homes are designed in a way where, garages are minimized and front porches are maximized. And so there's just been a lot of thought that's gone into it, but that slows down velocity and that makes it tough because home builders want to come in and take the 5 plans they build all the time that are the winners and just go build 10 of them and then move on to the next 10. And when you have a process that intentionally slows that down, then that kills sales and that kills velocity. So you've really got to have a lot of conviction that what you're doing is going to create more value long term and create more upside long term. And so we've struggled, frankly, to get builders to buy into the fact that you want to go through this painful process of looking at architectural standards that are going to change the way you do things everywhere else. So we have a home building business as well, and we've built about 65% of the homes that have been built in the Agrihood. If we didn't have that home building business, it'd be a little more challenging to kind of prove up the concept. We're doing an old Main Street right now. It's a commercial project. There's the old town of Cumming that we've extended a new street into our project and connected to that old town. And we've built 2 buildings that flank the street. And one building is the office building for People's Company. And so we're going to have about 80 employees in that building about a year from now at this time. And then there's retail on the lower level. And then on the other side of the street, we've got another building that mirrors it that we have 26 apartment units in it. And then we've got retail on the ground level. And so it looks like an old kind of Main Street town square building. We've got an orchard that we brought in, Wilson's Orchard. They've got a farm to fork restaurant, an event venue, fresh flower farm, strawberries, apples, farm market and whatnot. And so that's a destination that a lot of people come to visit. But yeah, there's a fair amount of commercial, fair amount of residential, some multifamily. It's a large master plan community, but the whole theme is agriculture.
I love that. What's it been like for you to raise capital on the project? Have you found that it's too complex, or has there been good reception there? Maybe without giving you a specific roadmap, how would you answer that question?
This is one of those projects that we've tried to more or less do ourselves. So we haven't been out raising capital for it. When we bought the land, it was, a little pioneering at the time, and we were maybe a little ahead of everybody else having visions for this area being developed. And so we bought the land at a price that was more sustainable to hold and whatnot. So as we've built it out, we've been able to largely do that without needing to attract outside capital in.
That's fantastic. How about the farming? What's going on there?
My partner in the project, his boy farms part of the ground, and then my dad and brother farm part of the ground. And then we've got a farm set up that we've got a farmer, Musa is his name, and he runs the garden and the farm. And we've got a self-serve garden stand set up, and people can buy veggies and flowers on the honor system. And we've got a couple hoop houses with some indoor garden plots, and people can rent their garden plot and put their own identity, plant what they want to plant. And they've got their, favorite sports team flags hanging up in their gardens and whatnot. And Musa does composting classes and things like that. And so next week we start our Friday at the farm, where we'll have 800 people out there every Friday, farmers market, food trucks, live music, where people are just out enjoying the farm and walking around with their kids and their dogs. And it's just a neat community gathering spot.
That'll be so cool to really pick up momentum there. Do you see other communities and other developers or farm owners that are looking at agrihoods as an interesting way in which they can maybe preserve farmland, but also receive some of that upside from the development?
There's a big movement nationwide, and I get called a lot from people that are like, "Hey, would you guys consider developing an agrihood and pick a community?" I mean, we literally get called a lot, and there's a lot of farmers in the world, and there's a lot of developers, but there's not too many people that are kind of doing both. And I think one of the things that we've done is really focus on how do we do this in a way where you're not putting the burden of having the farming on the HOA. Like, we've tried to set this up so, like, if you want to participate in the farm, you can, but you're not like burdened by subsidizing it and whatnot. I keep coming back to Journey, but we spent a lot of time, like, how do we do this in a way that people want to live here? The agriculture thing's not a gimmick. What you hear from some of the communities that have failed, where the developer came in, hired their trophy farmer, built a barn, and said, "Hey, we got an agrihood here," and then the the people that moved in didn't get the experience that they thought they were going to get. And so we've been really focused on making sure we deliver the experience that people think they're getting when they move into the community.
Yeah. Has there been pretty good reception from the residents that have been moving in?
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, I think it's been one of those things where you have these conceptual renderings of here's where the meadow is going to be, and here's where the mercantile is going to be, and here's where Main Street's going to be, and here's where the park, and here's where the orchard. And, initially, I think there's some healthy skepticism, like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it." Then I think there's also people that are like, "Hey, I want that to happen tomorrow." And, it's probably going to take 10 to 20 years to build the community out, but I think now people are really starting to see, like, wow, every year a couple new amenities get added, and it's legitimate. Yeah, there's a meadow walk tonight. We've got a 50-acre meadow that Moose is leading, and it's for the community only. So we're taking people on a little trail walk through the project tonight. There's just a lot of opportunities for community engagement. We did a thing at the Mercantile, which is a community gathering spot, wine bar. It was a grill out for the community members, and I think that's what people want. I think they want to be connected to their community, and they want to be connected to their neighbors, and they want to be outdoors. And frankly, that's what the whole Agrihood concept's all about.
Steve, departing question here. For anybody that wants to go create one of those communities, because you are multiple years into this journey, as you call it, what's the enduring piece of advice that you would give somebody?
Yeah, that's that's a good one. I think you've just got to really have conviction to see it through, because it's like, and you've got to do it at scale. I think we wouldn't be able to have all the amenities that we had if you didn't have that long term horizon over how all the pieces were going to fit together. Sometimes I'll say the whole Agrihood concept in and of itself is a little smoke and mirrors, because it's not just all chickens and pigs and that kind of thing. It's really the architecture that's unique, the street trees, the community programming, community engagement, and like putting all those pieces together. But it's less about agriculture and it's more about creating that community vibe. And so unless you have the conviction to like put all those pieces together, that's where when somebody says, "Hey, would you guys develop an agrihood in another community?" It's like, God, I don't know if I have that in me. This took 5 or 6 years to put all those pieces together, and if it wasn't in my hometown where I grew up, and I didn't have that conviction, I don't know. It'd be a tough journey for somebody to see through. So I don't want to be negative on it, but if you're going to commit to it, you've got to be really committed to the whole global picture.
Well, that's something coming from a guy that opened up 35 states with the independent brokerage and land management and buying companies and technology plays, and that you've accomplished a lot in the time and leadership at people's companies. So it's interesting to hear you say that about the development side of things.
I tell everybody, like, my entire career, interest rates have gotten cheaper every year too. So like there's been a little tailwind to help with some of these things. But what's been interesting to see on the Agrihood is that if you're going to move right now and you're going to move out of your 2 or 3% interest rate, you're going to go move into a new community or new home, then you're only going to do that if you feel like this is like, going to change my life type of move. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's like there's people that are coming out of the woodwork saying, hey, this is where I want to be, and I'm willing to get out of my cheap interest rate to move over here. And so we're seeing some of the wins now notch up for some of the conviction that we had early on. And I think that'll continue.
Well, Steve, thank you for your time. It is really fascinating to get your take on just where farmland is at, the overview of Middlebrook. I really recommend people check out Middlebrook Farm. It's a really fun-looking development. And if anybody's interested in farmland, People's company has just so many different services. It's almost easier to describe what you guys don't do than what you do. But Steve, we'll certainly have to check in whenever Middlebrook continues to build out into that vision that you guys have laid out. But I so appreciate your time for this episode.
Thanks for including me.
That is a wrap on today's episode, but I don't want this to be a one-way conversation. I'd love to hear about the projects and ideas you're working on. The best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. Just search Neal Collins. And if my team at Hamlet Capital or Latitude Regenerative Real Estate can help bring your vision to life, whether it's buying or selling a home or developing a community integrated within a farm, do not hesitate to reach out. Let's build something meaningful together.